Hey, so I see some people are already entering. I just want to welcome you to this webinar about the most important part of microdosing, which is dosing. Obviously, how do we take it? What's the calibration? When is too much? When is too little? All of these are really, really important things. So just as a first hello and welcome, I'd love to get a sense for everyone just to write in the chat box to tell me your name, to tell me where you're from, maybe a little bit about why you're interested in microdosing. So just go ahead and type here and let us know your name, where you're from, and just, your interest and reason in terms of why you're interested in microdosing. I assume we'll start the webinar about 5 minutes after 12. So that's about 5 minutes from now. I want to give everyone a chance to come in, to check things out, to make sure that, everyone is here who really needs to see this workshop. And this workshop today, this webinar, is going to be focused primarily on LSD microdosing in terms of how you properly measure it. We will also be talking about psilocybin mushrooms a little bit, but the focus will largely be on LSD. So yeah, everyone, welcome. As you're coming in, please just go ahead, write your name and where you're from, and maybe as well why you're interested in microdosing. I think this is going to be a really fun webinar today. I think you guys are going to learn a lot of practical information from this webinar, and so I'm really excited to get started. Like I said before, we'll start in about 5 minutes. It's going to be about 5 minutes before we start. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to get in the webinar. We already have 250 people in here, which is great. 250 people, that's fantastic. I'm going to wait till maybe we have about 300 to 400. So if we could just hold tight, and once we're all prepared, we will get going. I'm actually drinking something called lion's mane. It's a type of mushroom that actually can be used in combination with microdosing. This is something we actually talk about in our course. How do you combine microdosing with other modalities? And it's like a nice little thing from Four Sigmatic. Four Sigmatic, the mushrooms that you can make, they're really, really good. So like I said, we'll start in about 5 minutes. If you're just coming in, please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, and tell us maybe a little bit of why you're interested in microdosing. We have a lot of people. This is great. I'm so excited for all of you. Dave, Sean from San Francisco, Dre from Los Angeles. Cool. Mike also takes lion's mane. It's a great one. David from Seattle, Angela from Springville, Forrest from SoCal, Nuno from Lisbon. Nuno, I love Lisbon. One of my favorite cities in the world. I lived there for 4 months. It's great. Paul from San Clemente, Scarlett from Holland, Kat from Rockland, Mark from Massachusetts. Great, guys. This is great. We're seeing so many people who are coming in, who are interested in microdosing. I'd love for you, if you're new here, just go ahead, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and tell us a little bit about why you're interested in microdosing. And in about 3-4 minutes, we're actually going to get started with the information. In the meantime, I'll tell you a little bit about my story with microdosing, how I got going. Some of you may have heard it before. Jonathan, so do I, the Paul Stamets lion's mane blend. Really good. Fungi Perfecti, I think, is the brand. Really good stuff as well. So my own story with microdosing is really interesting. Back when I was in college, like 8 years ago, I took a bunch of LSD, maybe 15 or 20 times. And those experiences were really profound and impactful for me. So as a result of those experiences, I decided to pursue a more unconventional path, which led me to somehow starting a public website about microdosing. And when I microdosed, I noticed that it really helped me with two things. It helped me to reduce social anxiety. So when I was in more bigger partier situations, I'm more introverted. Sometimes I'm a little more withheld. The microdosing would allow me to be a bit more bubbly without the use of alcohol, which I really, really liked. And then it also helped me with creative projects for work. So if I needed to work as an entrepreneur, I wanted to build new ideas and work on new projects. So then it was also really helpful for that. This is about 3 years ago that I started microdosing, and it was profoundly impactful. It was profoundly impactful. In fact, I'm curious. I'm going to run. We have these cool little polls that we can do with the webinar. So I'm going to run a first poll, and I'm curious, how many of you have tried microdosing before? How many of you have you tried microdosing before? Yes, about 70%. No, about ooh, okay. So I'm going to see how this plays out. So have you tried microdosing before? Just go ahead and answer that poll for us. Like I said, we're going to get started with the slides in about maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I just want to make sure everyone has a chance to come here before we get going. So about 65% of you have tried microdosing before, and about 35% of you have not tried microdosing before. Now that's really, really interesting because one thing that I think about, particularly for the people who have tried microdosing before, is how effective was your microdosing protocol. So actually, I'm going to start a new poll real quick. So about 60% of you said yes, 40% of you said no. I'm curious. Hold on, I'm going to do a new poll for us. How many of you, I got to write it out quick, was your microdosing experience powerful? Yes, no. In other words, what I mean by that, and I'll explain, is was it effective? For the reason you went into microdosing, did something happen as a result of that? Or was there really no impact or benefit because of microdosing? So my microdosing experience was very powerful. And that's, of course, why I am so, such a kind of evangelist around it. So it looks like about 65% of you said yes, 35% of you said no in terms of your actual microdosing experience. Now, this is really, the reason I asked that question is because what we're going to talk about today in terms of calibration is really, really important in terms of getting that ideal experience, in terms of getting that ideal protocol. And if you can really hone in from a calibration perspective on the appropriate microdose for you and what you're doing, that I think leads to a higher probability and higher chance that you're going to have an impactful microdosing experience. This calibration aspect is so important because, as we'll get into later, some people just take too little, they don't notice anything. Some people take way too much and it's a little too overwhelming and it's not a microdose. It's a little bit more than a microdose. So we're going to talk about what is that sweet spot and how does that sweet spot maybe change based on your intention in terms of why you're getting into microdosing. Okay, so I think we have most of the people here today. I am by myself, so I might be a little, it might be a little bit difficult for me to get back to some of the questions, but I'm going to do my best to hop back and forth between, and we have about 330 people here now, so I want to go ahead and get started. So make sure you have some water, make sure you're comfortable, and then I will go ahead and I'll introduce myself a little bit as we get into these slides that we have. 1 second. Okay, you guys can see these slides. Can you see these slides okay? Am I getting a thumbs up? Great. I think I'm getting the thumbs up. And we're going to have time for questions, probably 10 or 15 minutes at the end. We'll go probably between an hour and 10 minutes. I'm not in a rush. It's a Saturday afternoon where I am, so I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. Okay, you guys can see this. Cool. I like this. So I'm going to be talking through these. You can see me in the lower right-hand corner as well. And again, please save your questions for the Q&A. I might hop in the middle, but most of the questions will have to be at the end. So as I said already, my name is Paul Austin. I'm the founder of The Third Wave, a website that focuses on improving psychedelic literacy and changing the cultural conversation around psychedelics through the topic of microdosing. And yes, this is being recorded. And some of you may know me from the email list. I've sent out a number of emails. Some of you maybe have seen talks that I've given. And so I just want to welcome all of you for being here today, for coming and attending this workshop about a topic like microdosing, because I think, microdosing is a really important topic. It is a really important topic because I think it offers hope. And it offers an avenue for so many things that we've struggled with as a culture and society for so long. And microdosing can help to facilitate healing, self-understanding, self-reflection for people because of what it does. And again, Calibration is one of the most important parts of that, which is what we're going to talk about today. So the most important microdosing is dosing. So what does that mean? Let's get to it. So here are the things that we're going to discuss today. Okay, so first of all, how to measure your dose appropriately with LSD. And this can also apply to something called 1P LSD. So it's going to be about measuring LSD, but this can also apply to 1P LSD, how to calibrate your dose. So that's how do you know when you've taken too little or when you've taken too much, and then how to know if you've done it right. Meaning, what we mean by that is you're going into your microdosing protocol with a specific intention or objective, and you want to make sure that your experience facilitates that, because I think 35% of you said microdosing really didn't work for you. It didn't really work for what you wanted. And that's not okay, because there are very specific things that we can do to optimize that protocol. We will talk a little bit about mushrooms, but because of a limited time frame today, we really only have an hour. We're really going to focus most of our efforts on LSD. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A for live audience members as well. So let's get right into it. Again, please save your questions for the end. I will do my best to get back to as many questions as possible, but for now, save them for the end. So, measuring your LSD microdosing. This is something that we call volumetric dosing. Okay, volumetric dosing is the most precise way to measure your LSD microdose. So, I'm going to give you a story real quick. I think this is a story that a lot of people share. When I first started microdosing with LSD, I was doing it in 2015. I was a little lazy in my approach, and so I just decided to cut tabs in a very inaccurate way. And that process of cutting the tabs was very inaccurate. So some days I would get a very low amount and I wouldn't really feel it at all. Some days I would get a pretty high amount, too high, and I couldn't really focus. I couldn't really do the work that I'd planned to do or just generally function like I wanted to function. And it's because I was not utilizing volumetric dosing. So what we do for volumetric dosing is we measure out a precise amount of distilled water. So for example, 100 milliliters. We pour the water into a clean, resealable, opaque container. We drop the tab or the liquid LSD in the water, being careful not to touch the tab with your bare skin. You'll seal the container and rigorously shake it for about 2 minutes. And then you'll cover the container so no light gets in and place it in the refrigerator for 1 to 2 hours. You do not need to remove the tab from the liquid. You can just keep it in there. Now, there are a couple of variations on this. One is some people will also put a little bit of alcohol in there, maybe a high potency vodka to help with a little high potency vodka to help make sure that it stays clean and there's no germ or bacteria applying it to it as well. So I'm seeing a lot of questions. I want to address a few things because a lot of people are also asking about mushrooms. What I will say is the stuff that we talk about in the latter half of this webinar will also apply to mushrooms, and I'll give those kind of like scales for mushrooms as well. But we'll probably have to do another webinar that goes deep into the specifics of like how you grind mushrooms, how you measure them out, how you put them in capsules, because like I said, we're just limited on time. Okay, so let's say, for example, let's walk through this as an example, just so that everyone has an understanding. Let's say you get a tab of LSD. Let's say it's 1P LSD. Okay, you get a tab of 1P LSD from a lab in Canada, which a lot of people are doing. You get it to your house and it has 100 micrograms of LSD on it, 1P LSD. So what you would do is if you measure out 100 milliliters of distilled water, you put the 1 tab in the distilled water. Now for every 1 milliliter of distilled water, you're going to have 1 microgram of 1P LSD. And that way you know that when you take it, that you're getting the precise amount that you intended. One of the challenges with, for example, if you purchase LSD is like on the dark web, for example, you sometimes don't know the potency. So what's best if you're acquiring LSD from the dark web or from, something that is not a laboratory, that you haven't tested and measured it yourself, I think it's a safe assumption to assume that the one tab is 100 micrograms as well. That's not going to be accurate. Sometimes it might be 95. Sometimes it might be 105. Sometimes it might be 110. But if you go at about 100 micrograms as an assumption, then you can measure it out pretty accurately as a result of that. Now I want to show you this. Okay, so I actually have a live kit that I want to show you. I'm going to get it real quick. It's just here in my office. And then I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to open it to you, and I'm going to show you then how you use each one of them if you're microdosing with LSD. So 1 second. Great. So this is a microdosing kit. You see that? It's a microdosing kit. We have these available on our website. And in this microdosing kit, you're going to get a few things. One is a syringe. Okay, so with a syringe, again, there's no needle on the end, just a very basic syringe. You can measure out the appropriate microdose so that you know exactly how much you're getting. So that's the first important piece. The other important piece is the opaque water bottle container. Let's see if I can make the screen bigger. Sure, yep, that's a good point. Is that better? Is that better? I think that's better. Okay, I will try that again. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the syringe, right? So as you can see, it has 10 milliliters, 8 milliliters, 6 milliliters. So what you can do is you can pull the syringe to accurately measure out the amount in the opaque container. So it's not completely opaque, I see someone saying, but it is brown, it's amber, so it's going to block most of the light from coming in, which is what you want. And so then what you do is, as you can see, there's a little bit of paper in there that we've already submerged. So what we do is we just open it, and I'm not going to do this right now, but you open it up, you put the syringe in, okay, you put the syringe in the bottle, and then you accurately measure it out to, for example, this would be about 9 milliliters. And then what I would typically do if I was microdosing today, for example, is I would just put it in my mouth like that. And that would be exactly 9 micrograms of LSD or 1P LSD. So that's a process that you would take. Now, one other thing, when you acquire LSD, always make sure to test your drugs. Always make sure to test your drugs. You need to make sure that it's the real thing. There have been reports lately of fentanyl, and this isn't to scare any of you, but it's also good, honest information. There have been reports lately of fentanyl, which is the opiate synthetic, being in LSD, mixed with LSD, which is pretty, excuse my French, but fucked up. LSD is non-toxic and non-addictive, as is psilocybin. So always test your drugs if you're getting it from anywhere except like a lab in Canada. And even then, it's probably best to test it. And then the other thing that you always want to be aware of, which I emphasized before, is don't touch LSD with your bare hands. Right. It could be MVOME as well. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yes. Don't touch LSD with your bare hands, which is where... Hold on. Fuck. Latex gloves really come in handy. So you want to have, if you're, for example, cutting up the LSD, and then you take the LSD, you don't want to touch it with your bare fingers because the oils on your bare fingers will make it bad. So you want to take it and you want to put it in the container like this with a glove on your hand. It's also really, really important to do. So you can test it we have these microdosing kits on our website where there are testing kits in there. If you want just a testing kit and you don't need the other things as well, then what you could also do is you can just Google like LSD drug testing kit, and then you can find a drug testing kit to test your LSD that way. We're going to keep going though, because I want to keep this pace moving. I do want to ask one more question of all of you. Just because I like to keep it a little bit engaging before we transition into the next part. And that question is, for those of you who have microdosed before, I'm just curious, what have you microdosed with? LSD or a similar analog like 1P LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, mescaline, ayahuasca, ibogaine, or other? So we have about 356 people in here, about 350, and that's crazy. It's only LSD and psilocybin mushrooms. I've microdosed once with ibogaine. I know Tim Ferriss also wrote about it in his book, Tools of Titans, and I think ibogaine would be really good for particularly opiate addiction, for detox, because it connects into the opioid receptors. I know, for example, clinics in Mexico who do the full-blown ibogaine treatment, and then we'll send people home with a little microdose to help facilitate that process. So it looks like many of you have microdosed with psilocybin mushrooms. About 40% of you have microdosed with LSD. And this is good. This is just general information that I'm trying to understand in terms of our audience. Let's now transition back into the PowerPoint. And here's just a little bit more information. So you saw all of these things already. A couple things to keep in mind. Once the LSD is in the solution, it will evenly distribute itself throughout after you shake it up. So all you need to do is, that means if you drop a 100 microgram tab, like I was talking about before, in 100 milliliters of solution, every 1 milliliter of solution will have 1 microgram of LSD. Therefore, when you're ready to dose, use a plunger syringe, as I showed you, or dropper to measure the amount that you want, and then squirt it into your mouth. It's pretty straightforward that way. Okay, so calibrating your dose. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about mushrooms as well, in terms of how to properly calibrate the dose level of mushrooms. So I think one thing to keep in mind with mushrooms compared to LSD is mushrooms are a little bit more inaccurate. And that's why we didn't do a webinar initially on psilocybin mushrooms, because with LSD and 1P LSD, you know exactly, basically you know exactly how much you're getting. It's much easier to be precise. One of the challenges for microdosing, which some of you may know already because you've microdosed the psilocybin, is the density of the psilocybin in, for example, one batch of psilocybe cubensis, and I may have pronounced that wrong, so please excuse that, may be different than the density of the psilocybin from another batch of cubensis. So for example, if you're microdosing with 0.2 grams of mushrooms consistently, you might notice some slight fluctuations in how you're feeling, directly because psilocybin mushrooms are a little less accurate in terms of their measurability process. With that being said, though, you should follow the same sort of protocol that we're going to talk about with LSD here. And I'd like to say something, and I'm going to set this as the sticky message, and that is, hold on, start low, go slow. Nicholas, correct me, potency, sorry, potency, not density. So the potency of the psilocybin in there. So start low, go slow. Start low. It's an easy little mantra and motto, because what that does is, particularly for those who haven't microdosed before, even those who have, the best way to calibrate your dose level is to start with a low amount and then incrementally work your way up. Because what we're doing is we're finding the proper dose for your own physiology, temperament, and goals in the process. Every single person is different. When I microdose, I usually microdose with between 15 and 20 micrograms of LSD. I have a high tolerance for substances. And a lot of people, it's a lame word. I know it's lame. That's why I use it, because then people remember it. Totally. I have a very high tolerance for substances, and I'm a larger male. So someone who is a woman who might be, 105 pounds, who is very sensitive to something like LSD, is probably going to need much less. She might need as little as 5 micrograms. So as a general rule, so you don't overdo it, you want to always start with a low dose. So the best way is to start with a small dose of about 5 micrograms of LSD. And for mushrooms, I would say about 0.1 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. So start at 0.1 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. And then once you've established how you respond to the initial starting dose by testing it for 1 week, then make incremental adjustments to more precisely hone in on the optimal level for you if necessary. Yes, weight and body mass does affect a dose. I'm just thinking of one of my sisters is quite small. She's like 5'4". She's 105 pounds. So a lot of you are like, 105 pounds, what? So that's just what came to mind right away. Start low and go slow and make incremental adjustments. So we have at the bottom here, what you can see is the typical dose day. So day 1, a dose day. Day 2, no dose day. You feel some of the after effects, some of the afterglow. Day 3, you're back to baseline. And day 4 is another dose day. Now, this is Jim Fadiman's protocol that he created. And a little bit of background. Now, none of you are assholes. None of you are assholes. You're all great. I love you all very much. I'm extremely happy that you're here on a Saturday to learn about microdosing. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Back to Jim Fadiman. So some of you may know who Jim Fadiman is, but I really want to make sure that all of you have at least a basic understanding. Jim is the man who wrote the psychedelic explorer guides. I do love you, Alex. Absolutely, I love you. Okay, I got to stop responding to all these comments. Jim wrote the psychedelic explorer's guide in 2012. He wrote it in 2012, and he had a chapter in there, chapter 16, on microdosing. And what happened is about 3 years later, in 2015, he was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and that's what kicked off this whole microdosing craze. Then Islet Waldman, who is an author, wrote a book about microdosing called A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. And that is how a lot of this kicked off. Now, the dose schedule that Jim recommends is this one, 2 times a week with 2 days off in between. 5 micrograms of LSD to start with, about 0.1 grams of psilocybin mushrooms to start with. Now, you should also know there are also other dose protocols that you can try. For example, what I do now when I microdose is when I first started microdosing, I did it twice a week for 7 months. But then I got to a point where I was like, okay, I did it twice a week for 7 months. Now I just want to do it on an occasional basis. For specific purposes. So now, like before I give public talks, like if I'm at a conference and I'm speaking about microdosing, I, of course, take a microdose because it's skin in the game. It's showing that, okay, I believe in this. I think it's effective. I think it's effective for this purpose and this reason. And so I'm going to take a small amount of this before I get up on stage and talk to you about it. So I tend now to pick specific protocols and intentions. But from a beginner perspective, which many of you are, I think about 40% of you have not tried microdosing before. And even those of you who have, I think when you get the most out of microdosing is when you're using it in a protocol. Sure, Jonathan, please recommend a Canadian pharmacy. That's fine. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So this is just a little bit more about calibrating your dose. So you can see this written down. And just so you know, we will send you these slides after as well. We'll send you these slides after so that you will have them. And that way you can make sure you do them. Yeah, so Paul Stamets is another one. And that's the other one that I wanted to mention. Paul Stamets is a famous mycologist. He's probably the best known mushroom expert. In fact, I'm reading one other thing. I'm reading Michael Pollan's book. You all need to be on the lookout for Michael Pollan's new book. I'm just going to write that here. Changing Our Minds by Michael Pollan. Hold on. Broadcast that. Oh yeah. Check out the book. I got an advanced copy. It's coming out in about 6 weeks or 5 weeks. And in it, Michael Pollan talks about his relationship with Paul Stamets and how Paul's just a really, really interesting guy. And he was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast. Maybe you all have heard of this before. And mentioned the protocol of 5 times a week, 2 days off. But instead of doing it at just maybe barely perceptible amounts, do it at a very, very low amount, right? So do it at a very sub-perceptible, almost like a fish oil supplement amount. And that's what Paul Stamets has also been talking about. Okay, so back to the calibrating your dose. I'm kind of hitting all cylinders right here. A good rule of thumb for calibrating your dose is to increase or decrease your dose by 1 microgram of LSD with each subsequent dose until you've identified where you want to be. For example, if you started microdosing with 5 micrograms of LSD, you would go up to 6, you'd go up to 7, you'd go up to 8. Precision is very important in this because a small adjustment can be the determining factor as to whether the protocol is best for you or not. So I wouldn't say it might be How to Change Your Mind. Double check that. Actually, you know what? The book's right here. What does that say? You're right. How to Change Your Mind. So that's Michael Pollan's new book. I'm reading through it right now. Great book. So I'll change that. I think Changing Our Minds was a book that was published by Don Lattin, who's another psychedelic author. So I'm going to put that there. Okay. So anyway, calibrating your dose by adjusting in submolar increments to be able to safely arrive at the precise dose that works for you. So if you're starting a microdosing protocol, give yourself a couple weeks at least to calibrate your dose level effectively. I could do it quite quickly because I had done LSD like 20, 25 times previous to starting microdosing. I think some of you who are maybe starting to microdose have never really done psychedelics before. So you need to first calibrate it appropriately and do it in small increments. Also, the first time you take a microdose, treat it like you would a higher dose experience. So don't put yourself in any sort of vulnerable positions. It should be on a weekend, or if you are self-employed on a day off. It should be at home or in nature, somewhere where you feel very comfortable. And you should not be like driving a car. You should not be, putting yourself in any sort of like stressful or vulnerable position if you are microdosing. So that's one more thing about calibrating your dose. Okay, so let's go through this idea of sub-perceptual. We're now transitioning from here are the exact points. Okay, so we talked about measuring out your dose amount. We talked about the syringe that you use. We talked about, start low, go slow. So when you're starting a microdose, start at a very low amount and incrementally increase. But then we need to know, because obviously we have this definition of microdosing, which is quote unquote sub-perceptible. So what does that mean? And do you really want that? Well, technically, as long as your dose does not result in any of the acute sensory effects typically associated with psychedelics, visual distortions, synesthesia, seeing geometric patterns, then it is considered sub-perceptible. But that doesn't mean you won't, quote unquote, feel your dose. When you drink a cup of coffee, you definitely feel the cup of coffee. It's definitely present. You have a little bit more energy. You're a little bit more focused. But unless you're overdosing on a dark roast from Starbucks, which maybe we do, yes, I'm recording this webinar, then it's not super, super present. So depending on your goals for your microdosing protocol, you may want to be more aware of the dose, or you might want to have as little awareness as possible. So I'm going to talk about sub-perceptible a little bit more. Just me and you. We're just going to talk what that means, because this is something that I struggled for a while. Like when I was starting to microdose, this was in Budapest a little less than 3 years ago. I was definitely taking, yes, best cup of coffee ever, for sure. I was definitely taking a little bit less than, no, a little bit more than a microdose. In other words, when I was taking the acid, I was getting a little bit high. I admit, I was getting a little bit high. It was nice. I had these feelings of euphoria. It was much easier for me to work on creative projects. It was much easier for me to really focus my energy into a specific project. I was more open and vulnerable emotionally, but it was slightly perceptible. There were no visual distortions. I had a slightly enhanced sense of touch. I had a slightly enhanced sense of smell, sense of taste. So the sensory effects were increased, but that worked for me. It really worked for me at that time, where maybe it was a little bit more. So don't be tied to a dogmatic description of microdosing. Microdosing, as Jim Fadiman once, he emailed me this a couple weeks ago. The optimal microdose is a dose that helps you have a really good day and that you didn't even notice that you took it. Okay, so it's a dose that helps you have a really good day, but you really didn't even notice really that you took it. That's the optimal microdose. Now, if you feel some slight effects, that's okay, but just no visual effects. You do not want any visual effects. Now, if we want to get into why definitions around this are important, it's because microdosing could be different than, for example, museum dosing. And this is really important when we talk about calibrating our dose levels for specific things. So, for example, if you're taking it as a supplement, right, like a really low amount, let's say you're taking like 0.1 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, or you're taking like 5 micrograms of LSD, and it has no effects whatsoever. It's very subperceptible. That might be perceived more as like a supplement. So, for example, when you take fish oil, you don't really notice anything the day of. But as you consistently take fish oil over a period of time, you might notice your skin becomes a little bit smoother. You have a little bit more mental clarity. You have a little bit more energy. That builds up over time. Taking microdoses at very, very subperceptible amounts likely does something similar in terms of what's going on in the brain. A microdose, then this technical word, is a dose that it's like a drug. You feel a little bit of it. You do notice a significant improvement or significant change the day of, likely, but also the days going forward. But again, it's not visually overwhelming. You can still go about your day-to-day activities as you normally would. And then we go into mini dosing, where mini dosing is quite perceptible. And mini dosing and museum dosing are about the same. So a museum dose, for example, would be about 50 micrograms, maybe 40 micrograms, depending on who you are. And that's a dose that makes experiences like museums or concerts very beautiful. It just really brings out that emotion. I did microdose today. I took a little bit of mushrooms today, just these little supplements that I have. So that's why calibrating your dose level is so important, is because we're trying to go towards specific ends or purposes. We're trying to orient these towards specific things. So I want to continue this example. When I am microdosing, for example, with LSD, I will usually go slightly perceptible, so maybe between a microdose and a mini dose. I will go slightly perceptible because I want to orient myself towards creative and the envisioning process. So if you're working on something and you want to brainstorm new ideas, then taking a little bit more of a microdose is going to help with that process. If you're just looking for something, for example, to wean off of antidepressants, then I think what a lot of people are doing is they're taking lower amounts, subperceptible amounts. People are also microdosing with cannabis to help with a lot of these things, because cannabis is legal in many, many states. So we won't really talk much about cannabis. In our online course, which we will talk about at the end of this webinar, in our online course, we have a thorough section on microdosing cannabis, as well as almost all the other substances and psychedelics. But that's also another interesting option, is microdosing in cannabis, because it's quite legal in many areas, in many states. So that's a little bit about calibration. Let's dig deeper now. I'm going to bring the PowerPoint back up for all of you. But before we go into the PowerPoint, I just want to ask one more poll. Jeffrey, I've combined LSD microdosing with rhodiola and CBD. I just took my CBD this morning as well. But I'm new to CBD. I haven't had it that long. So one more poll for all of you is going to be, one sec. Which mistake have you made in the past? Okay. So as we've already talked about, actually, I'm going to save that one for the end. I'm going to save that one for the end because we haven't talked about all those things yet. Okay, I'm trying to find my PowerPoint slide. Give me a second. There she is. Okay. So how do you know if you've done it right? How do you know if you have the right amount? I think this is a really important question because as we've already talked about, you start low and go slow. You calibrate your dose level effectively. You incrementally increase. So how do you know when you have the right amount? Simply put, the most clear sign that you've underdosed, so we'll start with underdosing before we work up, that you've underdosed is if you do not feel any change whatsoever after the first, I would say, week or even 2 weeks of your protocol. So the way that you know that you took too little is, so for example, let's say you are really looking to help to start microdosing to help with your energy levels, or maybe you're looking to microdose to help with creativity or focus, or maybe you're just looking for microdose to help deepen a spiritual practice, or for many of you, I think, to help with depression or addiction or some of these things. So if you've microdosed maybe for a week or two and you're not noticing any changes whatsoever, nothing has really changed, it could be that you've underdosed. Now, that's not 100% of the time. There are exceptions to that. So for example, some people who have been on antidepressants for a long time, they'll notice that when they start microdosing, they actually need to take much, much higher amounts to have the same effect. That's not everyone, but that can sometimes happen. The other thing is with people who underdose, some people microdosing just doesn't work for. Microdosing is not a panacea necessarily. It's not going to work for everyone every time. And so that's also something to be aware of, is if you've consistently microdosed, it might be that you've underdosed, it might not. So how do we know that? Obviously, the way that we know that is by doing it slightly higher. Okay, so the way that we know that is by increasing the amount that we have by a little bit. So if you've, for example, microdose for a week and you're not really noticing any impact or effect, then you could go higher. So for example, let's say you were doing it with 5 micrograms of LSD, you might go up, like we said before, to 6 for a week, and then you might go up to 7 for a week, and then 8. If you're a little more impatient like I am, you might go from 5 to 10 to 15. In fact, one thing that a lot of people will use and will do if they've been microdosing for a while and they're still like, they can't tell, is this having an effect? Is it doing anything to me? They'll take a higher dose. So they'll go and take like 50 micrograms of LSD instead of just 5 or 10. They'll make sure they create a safe space and environment for themselves so they can tell, is this actually effective for me? Because some people will take a lot of psychedelics and nothing will happen to them. So this is how we understand and determine this relationship in terms of what is an appropriate amount for us to be in. Because some of the benefits of microdosing can be quite subtle, so you need to give yourself a period of time to make sure that you've done it right. Now, what could go wrong? Okay, what could go wrong? So these are some common measuring and calibrating pitfalls. One is not using volumetric dosing and just cutting up your tabs. That can lead to significant inaccuracies. So it's important that if you want to be as precise as possible, that you cut up your tabs. 2 is microdosing every day. Psychedelics have short-term tolerance, and this is when the Fadiman protocol comes into tension with something like pulse Stamit's recommended. Pulse Stamit's recommended like 5 times on, 2 times off. but he was coming at it more from a supplemental perspective in terms of something that you might do on an ongoing basis. When Jim Fadiman spoke about it, it was just twice a week, because the idea is you can have pretty significant benefits from that first time. You could see the couple days after, and then you can do it once more and see what happens from there as well. So microdosing every day is not necessary or really any more effective. In fact, I think it could potentially have more negative consequences than just microdosing once or twice a week for two reasons. One, we don't know the long-term implications and effects of low-dose psychedelic use. We have plenty of data and research that shows that high-dose occasional psychedelic use is safe as long as, set and setting and the environment are paid attention to. But we don't know about incremental small doses over a long period of time. So it's important that we exercise caution. We don't microdose every day, especially at higher amounts, like 15 to 20 micrograms of LSD. Instead, save that for just twice a week. The other one is adjusting dosage into large of increments. And this is where some people also go wrong, is maybe they'll start at 5 micrograms, they'll notice nothing happens, and they'll go right up to 20 or 25 or 30 micrograms. At the very most, you should be increasing only by 5 micrograms, the very most. And if you're patient, and if you have time, I would say just 1 or 2 each time. And I would say for psilocybin mushrooms, that might equate to the most that you would want to increase is 0.1 grams. So if you've been trying 0.2 grams consistently and you want to maybe see, okay, is this working? Is this not? You could increase to 0.3 grams. And then finally, not using complementary practices to enhance your experience. This is so important. This is the most important part of microdosing. The most important part of microdosing, which is why I'm going to turn my screen share off and get real for a second. The most important part of microdosing is not actually just taking the drugs, because we do not want to become psychologically dependent on the drugs. There's okay to have a relationship and build that relationship with these substances. But I think what we don't want to happen is we don't want to feel like, okay, we can only be a certain way if we are microdosing with these substances, which is why complementary practices are so important for microdosing. Now, in our microdosing course, we go into depth on all of these complementary practices. So like, how do you combine meditation? How do you combine float tanks? How do you combine whatever else it might be with a microdosing protocol to maximize the impact and the efficacy of what you're doing? Because when you're microdosing, it's activating something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of 14 receptors. And so what you want to do, or what's going on, is you're really enabling neuroplasticity when you are microdosing with a psychedelic, just like you are with meditation, just like you are with a float tank. So what we're doing is we're rewiring our neural circuitry, and our brains are malleable, they're plastic. So to make sure that that remains where it is, it's really important that you tie the microdosing to other practices that also help to facilitate a foundation so that you don't feel reliant on an external substance. Now, with that being said, I will say that I microdose pretty consistently, and I also meditate, and I do things like float tanks and exercise and whatever else it might be. So it's not to say that you can't microdose on a consistent basis. From my understanding of what we know, there are a lot of benefits to it. However, I think it is good to combine it with other practices so that you can get the most out of it. And again, this is what we go into depth in our microdosing course. So I just have one more question for you. We're going to do a brief review of what we just spoke about, and then we're gonna wrap up and conclude the webinar briefly. So Dave, we're not really getting into mushrooms. I briefly touched on it a few times. So today is only focusing on LSD because we only have an hour or so, and I want to make sure that we respect people's time. We'll do another webinar likely on mushrooms, maybe at some point in the future. We don't have any plan, but that might happen. We do have a lot of information about mushrooms in our microdosing course, which we have available. But like I said, we were limited on time today, so we couldn't get to that. So let's ask one more poll, one more question. And again, this will really only be for people who have already microdosed. Which mistake have you made in the past when it comes to microdosing? I've made the cutting up the tabs mistakes. I've made the taking too much on accident mistake. I usually use complementary practices, but not all the time. Interesting. So I want to keep seeing how these results come in. We'll give it a couple more minutes, and then we're going to go back. We're going to review, and then we're going to say, okay, if you want to learn more, here are next steps in terms of, okay, we have a basic knowledge somewhat of calibrating and microdosing. What can we do going forward? 17% cutting up tabs, 10% microdosing every day, 30% taking too much an accident, and 45% not using complementary practices. And I think that's the biggest thing. We got to use complementary practices to really integrate those experiences. And again, that's what our course really focuses a lot on. So let's review. Just briefly, we're going to review. So we talked about how to measure your dose. We talked about how to calibrate your dose. We talked about how to know if you've done it right. We've also talked about measuring your LSD microdose with volumetric dosing, again, with the little bottle and the syringe. We have these kits available on our website. If you want to get one, it will help. We talked about how 100 microgram LSD tab dropped in 100 milliliter of water means 1 microgram for every 1 milliliter. We talked about calibrating your dose. The best way is to start low and go slow. Start with a small dose of LSD, 5 micrograms. For psilocybin mushrooms, that might be 0.1 grams. Increasing it slowly, right? From 5 to 6, 6 to 7. If you're a little bit more impatient, maybe 5 to 10, but I wouldn't jump any more than from 5 to 10 because that can be quite a jump. And we're very sensitive to these substances and to these things. And then what does subperceptible really mean? We talked about the difference between maybe a supplement level, a subperceptible level, and a museum dose level. And how you can utilize each of those for specific purposes. So if I'm in a really focused flow state mood, I'll take a little bit less. If in a more creative brainstorming mood, I'll take a little bit more. How to know if you've done it right. Okay, here are some signs that you may want to decrease your dose. You have problems focusing. You feel giggly or heightened sense of anxiety. You generally feel a little off, or you have a slight mood or visual disturbances, or strong emotional insights rising to your awareness that you don't feel capable of addressing in the context you're in. Okay, so that's another thing in terms of how do you know if you've done it right. I know I seem to have missed this slide, but that are some of the things you may run into if you take too much. Problems focusing, giggly, a little anxiety, feeling a little off, and some maybe slight mood or visual disturbances. Okay, so now we've kind of reached the end. So basically, we've talked about the basics of microdosing in terms of measuring LSD and calibrating it. However, as I've emphasized again and again in this conversation, the potential of microdosing is so much greater. I think there are a lot of people who just assume microdosing is taking a low amount of a psychedelic twice per week and seeing what happens. But there's so much more that you can do around your microdosing protocol to optimize it for the best experience. Journaling, intention setting, knowledgeable experts and interviews, complementary practices, explicit directions and help, a community of people and microdosers who are also microdosing. And this is what we're offering with our microdosing course membership. So basically, there's a written course curriculum covering everything from the science of microdosing to how to measure and store your dose to best practices for optimizing your experience. We have demonstration videos, somewhat like I did today, but even more with psilocybin mushrooms, a demonstration video, as well as demonstration videos and other things that you can do. There are exclusive expert interviews with specialists in related fields, clinical psychiatry, biohacking, meditation, metaphysics. We have an integrative psychiatrist who we've interviewed. We have a psychotherapist who we've interviewed. We have an Mdma researcher. We have a number of other expert interviews lined up of people who are doing research with microdosing, who are answering our community's questions about what's going on when we microdose. How can we use microdosing for this purpose or this purpose or this purpose? Then there's 6 months free access to our members only online community. I think this is the best part, because a lot of us who are taking psychedelics, who are microdosing, who are new to this, we have no one else to talk to. We have no one else to talk to when it comes to this, except for situations like this. So we've created a community where you can connect with a bunch of other microdosers, hundreds of other microdosers from around the world, and probably in your city if you live in a big city. So you can start to build that community and ask questions within that community. And then we also include a microdosing workbook, which allows you to prepare before your microdosing experience by cultivating deep intention, allows you to track actually what's going on when you microdose, so you can notice psychometric changes when you're doing it. And then we also have a tracking template, and this helps to guide, monitor, and optimize your day-to-day experience. The whole thing comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. We really invested a lot of time and effort into this project. It means a lot to us. We think it's really valuable for a lot of people. And that way, for that reason, we feel confident giving a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you were to buy it today or at some point in the future, within 30 days, if it's just not what you expected or what you wanted, you can go ahead and get your money back. So we're going to get to questions in a sec. What I do want to say is that if you purchase today, you'll also receive a free electronic copy of a new book that I just published called Microdosing Psychedelics, A Practical Guide to Upgrade Your Life. It's about 140 pages. We spent about a year working on this. So you're also going to receive a free electronic copy of that today if you register for the microdosing course. So that's one little bonus that we're giving to everyone, to both thank you for coming and to acknowledge your contribution. And then one more thing, for the first 15 registrants who register today for the microdosing course, you'll receive a free consulting session with Charlie, who is this striking gentleman who, and Charlie, say hi. I know you're in the chat somewhere there. So go ahead and say hi. And he's a seasoned multi-industry entrepreneur and passionate mental health advocate. Charlie has extensively microdosed himself and basically helped to build the microdosing curriculum. And that is a $127 value. Normally to set up these 30-minute calls, it's $127. For the first 15 people who register today, it's completely free. So you get to hop on a phone call with Charlie. He'll walk you through the process. He'll answer all your questions that you have, and he'll make sure that you get what you need so that you can optimize your protocol as much as possible. So one last thing. This is what a few of our course members have said about the microdosing course. It's great for everyone from absolutely no experience with psychedelics to the most experienced who would like to improve their microdosing techniques or wellness tracking. Its contents have a perfect balance between scientific research, practical recommendations, and experiences. I consider it to be very holistic, informational, and inspiring. This course is a must-take for experience enhancement and harm reduction purposes. The microdosing course gave me permission to spend time developing myself and helped me open myself up for reflection and growth in a controlled way. It was great to share stories and the experience with all types of wonderful characters from across our beautiful planet and to create the space to reinvent ourselves. This course helped me to optimize and structure my microdosing protocol. It gave me the knowledge and skills to fulfill the potential benefits of microdosing. In addition, it made me aware of how to monitor those benefits. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put this up. Obviously, I'm also hanging around for all the questions that you have, so I'm not going anywhere. And the information is now up. So if you'd like to access and purchase the microdosing course, like we said, the first 15 registrants today for the microdosing course get a completely free 30-minute consulting call with Charlie, and all of you for attending the webinar are going to get a free copy of our electronic book. So we want to thank you for attending the webinar. We want to thank you for doing that. And if you guys could just click on that, click on the Get Access Now, and just, Charlie, can you let me know if it works? Can you all let me know if that link works for the Get Access Now? I just want to make sure that everything is good. It looks like it's working for me. It definitely looks like it's working for me. So like we said, we'll go ahead now. We'll just keep that up. If, like I said, the first 15 registrants today will get a free 30-minute consulting call with Charlie. And one thing to emphasize is we are in the process of declaring nonprofit status and working towards that angle. So also by enrolling in this course, you are actively contributing to the Third Way's mission and the psychedelic movement. That means funding research into microdosing, changing the cultural conversation around responsible use of psychedelics, and helping us avoid advertising to remain 100% community supported. We do not have any advertisements on our site. I want to keep it that way. And the team that's working on this, and there are about 6 or 7 of us, are trying to make this work. It is stressful. It's financially difficult, but we are doing our best, and we believe in this course, the material that we provided, and think that would significantly benefit anyone who has questions or is interested about the topic of microdosing. So that's all I'm going to say about that. That's it. What I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to get your questions answered now. So let's go ahead. I'm going to move over to the Q&A and see where we're at. One sec. Okay. So what time of day can you microdose? That is the first one that I got. I think the best time of day to microdose is in the morning. And that's especially if you're microdosing with LSD. Microdosing with LSD lasts about twice as long as psilocybin mushrooms. So if you're going to microdose with LSD, you want to do it as early as possible. So usually I microdose first thing in the morning when I wake up, and then I go from there. So Mike asks, whether it's psilocybin or LSD, what should someone do if they experience a small amount of anxiety on a dose day? I think the best thing is some sort of box breathing, sitting down, meditating for a little bit, watching, feeling your breath come in and your breath come out, sitting with yourself, potentially doing some box breathing and trying to relax. I've been struggling with anxiety lately as well, largely because I live in New York, and I've been trying to really focus in on things that I can do to improve that. So Heidi says, you didn't mention how many drops of liquid LSD to put in the 100 milliliters bottle. So what you do is you take 100 milliliters of distilled water, and if you have, for example, liquid drops of LSD, and 1 drop is 100 micrograms, then you're only going to put 1 drop in the distilled water, because then you'll have 100 micrograms to 100 milliliters, which means for every 1 milliliter, you'll have 1 microgram. So someone asked, can you build up tolerance to your dose? Do you need to take more, or do you need to take regular breaks? So you can build up tolerance to the dose, especially if you do it 2 days in a row. Which is why we recommend the Fadiman protocol. Only do it twice a week, okay? Only do it twice a week, and after, like 5 or 10 weeks, take a break. I think the same thing applies to microdosing as coffee and other, things that we use to help improve our performance and well-being. I think it's always good to take some breaks to get us back to baseline, to understand where we're at before we continue further. I'm getting some more questions now. So Bjorn Eric asks, can microdosing help heal chronic fatigue syndrome? I do not have an answer for that. I do not know. I think that's a really great question, and something that we can explore in our expert interviews in the online course and community. But like I said, that's not a question that I know off the top of my head. So Barrett asks 3 questions. What am I testing for, and where do I get it? So if you're testing for LSD, which you probably will be, you can just type in LSD testing kit, and you can find it on there. We also have microdosing kits that are available for purchase on our website. Dose regimens, what are the names of the 2-dose regimen, i.e. twice a week? That's just what we call the Fadiman protocol, versus the 5 days on is the Stamets protocol, I would say. And it's just named after the people who kind of came up with them, because there's really no mature vernacular around microdosing yet. And dose amounts. What are the measurements levels to be categorized as microdose versus the dose amount for mini dose. I would say a microdose would be anywhere from like 10 to 20 micrograms, maybe 5 to 20 micrograms, and a mini dose might be closer from 25 to 40 micrograms. But again, it's so individual. It depends on the individual, it depends on why they're microdosing, it depends on who they are, their physiology, all of these things. So for time of day for microdosing, in the morning is best. How do you test the LSD? With an LSD testing kit. Can you microdose MDMA? You can, but we have an article on our website that says how we think it's best not to microdose with MDMA because it might show potential for neurotoxicity over an extended period of time. So what we say is probably for now it's best not to microdose with MDMA until we have more data and information. We know that LSD and psilocybin mushrooms are non-toxic, they're not addictive, they're very, very safe. We can't say the same about MDMA necessarily. John says, if I feel some anxiety when I microdose, does that mean the dose is too large? Most likely. If you're feeling anxiety when you microdose, that might mean the dose is too large. It's best to go down. If you go down, you're still feeling that anxiety, it's probably just best to stop then. Because it can speed things up at times. Exactly. So MDMA can cause heart issues with prolonged use. So do we have any other questions? Anything else that's coming up? Okay, so we've had a few sales now. That's good. I was so busy answering the questions. So we still have about, I need to double check this, but we still have about 10 of the consulting calls left. We still have about 10 of the consulting calls left. And I know there are some directions as well. So there are still about 10 left. So we're going to leave them. Like I said, if you purchase today, you will get access to the free consulting call, as well as our 30-day money-back guarantee and 6 months of free community access. Okay. So we're going to leave about 5 more minutes for questions, and then I will have to get going. So we only have about 10 units left. So I'd say if you want access to the free consulting call, like we said, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. Just go ahead and you can get that now. Let me check the questions, and then we'll probably wrap up. Sounds great, Mark. Thank you so much. I support your program, Paul. Way to go. I'm soundly in. Microdosing before bed is probably best not to do. What size dose do you use for brainstorming, Paul? Usually 20 to 25 micrograms. So usually 20 to 25 micrograms for brainstorming, maybe slightly higher, maybe 30 to 35. It just depends on the day and the environment. Benjamin asks, how do you slip a high dose into a microdosing protocol? One of the best ways to slip a high dose into a microdosing protocol is, I would say, make sure you do it at least 2 to 3 days after a microdose. And that's really all you should need to do. There shouldn't really be any other conflict or overlap there. It should be pretty straightforward and simple to handle. Does it have to be on an empty stomach? Not necessarily. I've microdosed with food before. I think that should be perfectly fine to also microdose without it, without needing to have an empty stomach. Jen asks, is this safe for younger people, as in folks whose brains have not fully developed? I don't know if I am qualified enough to answer that question. I would stick to the regular, these substances should only be utilized by people who are 18 or older. I think that's the safest route to go. But yeah, for brains who have not fully developed, hard for me to say. So Jen asks, why are you not talking about concurrent illnesses and microdosing? That's a great question, Jen. Mostly because I don't have a medical background. So while I can talk about the phenomena of that people are microdosing for depression and people are microdosing to treat these other things, I don't have the medical background and the expertise to talk about. That's why we interview all these experts in the microdosing course, because then in the course, we ask them about all these medical questions, so that they can give really, really good responses and answers for people who are looking to microdose for depression, who are looking to microdose for PTSD, for trauma, for these other things, and help them understand why microdosing can be effective at treating that and helping that. But again, I don't have a medical background, so I don't, when I do these webinars, I won't really prepare much of that information or give it. We do have some articles on our website that go into that, but the focus mostly is on the basics at the moment. Yes, that's correct. So first name says, I'm math challenged right now. If one drop is 1 microgram in my solution, would I take up to 5 drops? Correct, for 5 micrograms. That is correct. That would be 5 micrograms. Marissa asks, can you microdose if you're taking an adaptogen such as schizandra? I don't know schizandra. Hold on, let me Google it. I would imagine it's fine. I microdose with rhodiola, which is also an adaptogen, and that seems to be perfectly fine. So I can't imagine it being an issue at all. Does vitamin C enhance absorption? I'm not sure. It might, but I don't think it would necessarily. I think that's somewhat of a myth that if you drink acid with water or something, that you'll be, or if you drink acid in orange juice, that you'll be more likely to have a hard trip. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true. Let me see what other questions we have. What other supplements would you recommend with microdosing? Lion's mane is great. Fish oil I take. L-theanine is great. I've been drinking matcha lately. I use a lot of medicinal mushrooms. Rhodiola is another one that I use. So those are the basics one. What dose of lion's mane do I use? I use one of these packs. These come from Four Sigmatic. So I use one of these packs, which has about 3 grams in it, and then you just dissolve it in water and you can drink it. And that's really, really easy. Okay, so that I think wraps up all the Q&A. We've been going a little bit over an hour now. Arena, I think we can talk about psychological dependency and microdosing. I think that would be a really good topic, either for the community or for the next webinar. So I'm going to go back to full screen now. I want to thank all of you for attending today. I want to thank all of you for listening and for learning and taking the time on your Saturday to join us. The course will be available for sale over the next couple days. So if you don't really, you're not sure if you want it now, but you would like to have it, it will be available. Again, the 30-day money-back guarantee, access to the microdosing community, and I think we have just a couple units left of the free consulting call. We've already had a number of people who have taken that and purchased, but we still have a couple left for those of you who also want access to it. So I want to thank all of you for attending today. We do have to get going now. We will send a replay, and we are planning to do these again very soon. So there will hopefully be another one within the next month or 2. Okay. Bye-bye.